God, Dad, can you at least wear a long-sleeved shirt? Those scars are disgusting." The words, sharp and cold as shattered glass, sliced through the warm afternoon air. My son Michael didn't even look at me as he said them. His eyes were fixed on the gleaming metallic blue hood of his new car, polishing an invisible speck of dust with the cuff of his $1,000 suit jacket. Disgusting. I looked down at my own arm, at the roadmap of a life he would never understand. A silvery puckered scar near my elbow from a burst hydraulic line in '83. A lattice of faded white lines across my forearm from a broken cutting die in '97. Each mark was a testament, a chapter in the long, brutal story of providing for him. These were the scars that had paid for the private grade school so he wouldn't have to go to the rough one by the factory. They paid for the braces that straightened his teeth, the SAT tutors that got him into a good college, the law degree that now allowed him to stand here, in the driveway of the house these scars built, and be repulsed by the very sight of them. The car itself, a machine of obscene beauty and power, was the final page in that story. I had drained what was left of my retirement account to help him with the down payment, a gift for making partner at his firm. He called it a symbol of our success. Our success. I felt a cold, hollow space open up in my chest, a void where pride used to be. My gaze drifted from my arm to the car. It was perfect, a seamless piece of engineering. But my eyes, trained by 50 years of listening to the whispers of stressed metal, caught something. It wasn't something you could see. It was a feeling, a faint, almost imperceptible tremor through the soles of my worn work boots as the engine idled, a slight disharmony in the engine's purr. It was the sound of a bearing, somewhere deep inside, that wasn't seated quite right. It was a tiny, insignificant flaw that, in 6 months, maybe a year, would grow into a catastrophic failure. He didn't hear it. To him, it was just the perfect sound of wealth. "It's a beautiful machine, Michael," I said, my voice rough. He finally turned, a smug, satisfied smile on his face. "It's not a machine, Dad. It's a statement." He looked me up and down, his eyes lingering on the faded blue of my work shirt, the grease permanently ground into the skin of my hands. "Which is why we need to talk about appearances." That was when he said it, about the scars. My mind reeled back, away from the sterile shine of his car and the casual cruelty in his voice, back to a time when those scars were earned, back to the deafening roar of the factory floor, a world of fire and pressure that I had entered as a boy of 18. I remembered the weight of the steel beams, the searing heat of the forge that made the air shimmer. I remembered working double shifts, my body screaming with exhaustion just to make the tuition payment for his first semester of college. I ate standing up, slept in 4-hour increments, and pushed my body past its limits, all fueled by the image of my son in a classroom, learning about a world far away from this one. I sacrificed my youth, my health, my hearing, laying it all down on the altar of his future. And for what? For this moment. For him to stand here, a perfect product of my imperfect labor, and look at the evidence of my sacrifice with disgust. The silence he left behind was a physical thing, a heavy, smothering blanket that amplified the echo of his words. Disgusting. It wasn't just a word. It was a solvent, dissolving the memories of pride I'd painted onto these walls, stripping them back to bare, cheap drywall. Every scuff on the floorboards, a testament to a childhood of muddy shoes and toy cars, now looked like a stain. The faded square on the wallpaper where his mother's picture used to hang was no longer a bittersweet memory. It was just an empty, yellowed space. I fell into my armchair, the springs groaning a familiar complaint. The fabric was worn smooth where my shoulders and head rested, a perfect mold of my absence. This chair had held me through the grief of his mother's passing, through the anxiety of waiting for his college acceptance letter, through the quiet, lonely pride of his first job offer. Now, it felt like a throne of defeat. The weariness wasn't just in my bones anymore. It had seeped into the marrow of my soul, a cold, heavy sediment. I had won the war for his future, only to be left a forgotten casualty on the battlefield, my own sacrifices used as the very weapons of my irrelevance. My eyes drifted to the mantelpiece, to a small framed photograph of Michael at 12. He was grinning, a gap-toothed smile, his arm slung around my neck, both of us covered in grease from trying to rebuild the carburetor on my old pickup truck. His hands then were small and already getting stained with the same grime that was now a permanent feature of my own. He'd looked at my hands back then, not with disgust, but with awe. "You can fix anything, Dad," he'd said, his voice full of a faith so absolute it felt like a physical force. Where did that boy go? Was he sanded away by business school, polished into oblivion by corporate seminars on professional presence? Or had I, in my relentless push to give him a better life, inadvertently taught him that the world I came from was something to be escaped and ultimately erased? The ghost of the factory rose, sharp and specific, the searing kiss of a white-hot steel sliver in my forearm, the sizzle and the stench of my own burnt flesh. That small, silvery scar, a permanent token of that place, was the one his delicate sensibilities found so offensive. But the sound was the worst of it. A deafening, all-consuming roar of machinery, of hammers meeting metal, of conveyor belts groaning under impossible weight. It was a sound that didn't just damage your ears, it invaded your dreams. For 30 years, I'd woken up to a high-pitched ringing in a silent house, the factory's phantom tinnitus a permanent souvenir. I gave my hearing, so his could be filled with the soothing, sterile purr of a German engine and the murmured pleasantries of boardrooms. I pushed myself out of the chair, the movement stiff, and walked to the kitchen. The Formica countertops, the chipped sink, the humming refrigerator. It all felt like a museum exhibit titled, "A Life of Toil." I opened the fridge, the light illuminating a half-empty bottle of milk, some cold cuts, a six-pack of cheap beer. My dinner most nights. I'd eaten countless meals like this alone, while picturing him at some university dining hall or a nice restaurant with friends, nourishing himself on the future I was forging for him with every swing of my hammer. A bitter laugh escaped me, harsh in the quiet. Appearances. He was worried about appearances. What was the appearance of a man who'd spent his life as a cog in a mighty, grimy machine? It was the appearance of strength, of endurance. The grease in the cracks of my hands wasn't dirt. It was the indelible ink of 1,000 paychecks, 1,000 tuition payments. The slight stoop in my shoulders wasn't a deformity. It was the architecture of carrying burdens so he wouldn't have to. I looked at my reflection in the dark window over the sink. An old man stared back, his face a roadmap of long shifts and hard lessons. The scars he despised were my medals of honor, earned in a war he never had to fight. He saw a flawed product. I saw the living price of his success. Closing the fridge, I left the kitchen and stood in the center of the living room, the heart of my empty kingdom. The fight had gone out of me, leaving behind a cold, clear certainty. The dissonance wasn't in the engine of his car, it was in the very foundation of our relationship. I had built the bridge between us, and now he stood on the other side, criticizing the craftsmanship. The anger finally came then, not a hot, raging fire, but a slow, cold crystallization. It wasn't directed at him, not entirely. It was at the cruel irony of it all. I had offered up everything, my youth, my health, my quiet moments, on the altar of his future. And the God I had worshipped had turned out to be a vain, ungrateful stranger who was embarrassed by the altar itself. The house was silent. But for the first time, the silence wasn't empty. It was filling with the grim, solid weight of a truth I could no longer ignore. The most catastrophic failure wasn't in a bearing deep within an engine. It was in the space between a father's sacrifice and a son's understanding. Later that night, unable to sleep, I found myself in the garage, my sanctuary. The air smelled of oil and old metal, a perfume more comforting than any cologne. This was a place of honest work, of tangible problems with tangible solutions. Here, A seized bolt could be freed with penetrating fluid and leverage. A misaligned belt could be tracked and tightened. The logic was pure, the results immediate. Unlike the cryptic, emotional machinery of my son, my eyes fell on a heavy, dust-covered toolbox in the corner, one I hadn't opened in years. The lock was stiff, but it gave with a gritty pop. Inside, nestled in faded yellow foam, lay my old diagnostic tools from the plant. Specialized stethoscopes for listening to the heartbeat of engine blocks, ultrasonic testers for detecting the hidden hairline fractures in metal, tools that required an ear and a touch, not a computer screen. They were relics of a time when expertise was felt in your fingertips, a vibration you learned to interpret through years of communion with machines. I picked up a vibration tuner, its cold, solid weight a familiar comfort in my palm. It was a simple device, really, a calibrated mass on a spring. But in my hands, it had been a divining rod for imbalance. I remembered my reputation at the factory. The old man, who could hear a coming failure from 50 feet away. The younger guys, with their tablets and their diagnostic software, would scratch their heads at a low, intermittent hum. They'd run their programs, get a dozen green lights and declare the machine fit. But I'd stand there, eyes closed, just listening. I'd hear the ghost of a wobble in the main drive, a whisper of a misalignment they couldn't yet quantify. "It's in the third bearing," I'd say. "It's got another week, maybe 2. They'd look at me like I was some kind of witch doctor, until a week later the machine would scream to a halt, and the maintenance report would confirm a catastrophic failure in the third bearing. They never understood it was a language. I had learned to speak the quiet, desperate language of metal under stress. And now, standing in the profound silence of my garage, I realized I had been trying to speak a different language to my son for years, a language of sacrifice, of quiet endurance, of love, built not with words, but with actions. I had been pointing my internal stethoscope at him, listening for the hum of gratitude, the smooth purr of understanding, but all I ever heard was the dissonance. The criticism of my grease-stained hands, the embarrassment at my stooped posture. I had built my entire life around him, and now I was left with a quiet, inexplicable error I could not comprehend. I ran my thumb over the dial of the tuner, the glass clouded with age. The grim certainty from the kitchen had followed me here, crystallizing around this new, painful thought. I finally understood. I had built a bridge from my world of necessity to his world of opportunity, using my broken back and 1,000 missed moments as the materials. I never expected him to come back. I only wanted to see him thrive on the other side. But he did come back, and he stood on the far bank, looked back at the bridge, at me, and instead of seeing the sheer, brutal engineering of it, all he saw was the rust on the steel, the crude welds, the ungraceful angles. He was criticizing the craftsmanship of the very structure that had delivered him. A dry, hollow sound escaped my lips, not quite a laugh. I had spent a lifetime diagnosing the faint tremors that presaged a breakdown. I had heard the faint metallic sigh of a connecting rod about to let go from 3 aisles over. How had I been so deaf to the slow, grinding failure happening in my own home? The signs were all there. The clipped phone calls, the way his eyes would dart around the living room as if looking for a hidden camera, the carefully worded explanations of his life that subtly edited me out of the picture. I placed the vibration tuner back in its foam cradle, the gesture feeling like a final goodbye. These tools were for a world where problems could be fixed. What was broken between us wasn't a matter of calibration. You can't torque a relationship back into spec. You can't replace a worn-out bearing of resentment. The foundation was cracked, the very bedrock of what I thought we were. A father who provided, a son who understood, had shifted, and the entire structure was now unstable. Closing the toolbox lid was like closing a coffin on a part of myself. The latch clicked shut with a definitive finality. The sanctuary of the garage had been breached. The smell of oil now seemed like the scent of futility, the old metal just a collection of dead things. My kingdom wasn't just empty, it was a ruin, and I was the ghost haunting it, the only one who could still see the blueprints of what it was supposed to be. The most catastrophic failure wasn't in a bearing deep within an engine. It was in the space between a father's sacrifice and a son's understanding. And for that vast, silent emptiness, I had no tools. The hollow ache in my chest began to solidify into a cold, hard resolve. The sadness curdled into anger. An anger not just at my son, but at the world he represented. A world that valued polished surfaces over the grit of experience. He was ashamed of my scars, but he would not be allowed to be ignorant of the knowledge they represented. I would not argue with him. I would not plead for his respect. I would demonstrate it. I would give him a lesson in the brutal, honest language of cause and effect. My eyes swept over the graveyard of my garage. The old metal, the dead things. They weren't dead. They were dormant. They were waiting for a hand that understood their language, a will that could command their latent potential. The scent of oil was no longer futility. It was the smell of potential energy. The cracked foundation of my relationship with Michael couldn't be repaired, but perhaps a new structure could be forged. Something built not on the shifting bedrock of expectation, but on the unshakable truth of physics. I knew what I had to do. It was a project I'd dreamed of for 20 years, a fantasy for a quieter, more prosperous time that had never come. The '57 Chevy Bel Air, a two-door hardtop that had been sitting under a dust-laden tarp in the far corner since before Leo was born. It wasn't a car. It was a carcass. A beautiful, ravaged skeleton. The frame was sound, but the floorboards were lace, the engine a block of rusted ambition, the interior a nest for mice and memories. I had always called it my someday project. Someday was now. I walked over to it, my boots echoing on the concrete, and took a corner of the tarp. With a single sharp pull, I unleashed a cloud of dust motes dancing in the slanted afternoon light. There she was, sea spray green, or what was left of it, faded and blistered by time. I placed a hand on the fender, the cold metal a shock against my palm. This wasn't a retreat. This was a declaration of war. A war against the silent emptiness, against the polished lie my son was living. The plan was simple, its complexity a feature, not a bug. I would rebuild the Bel Air from the ground up, not to its original showroom perfection. That was his world. I would build it into something else entirely. A restamod. A fusion of old soul and new muscle. I would graft a modern LS engine into its vintage bay, a heart of silent computerized power in a body of pure analog aggression. I would install a custom independent rear suspension, disc brakes on all four corners, a painstakingly wired Holley digital dash. It would look like a classic, but it would drive like a predator. And Leo would help me. He wouldn't have a choice. He was coming for dinner on Sunday, a dutiful monthly pilgrimage I knew he dreaded. I would not ask him. I would present it as a fait accompli. I needed his help, I would say. My back wasn't what it used to be. I needed someone with young arms to hold a transmission, with sharp eyes to trace wiring diagrams. It would be a lie wrapped in a truth. I did need him. Just not for the reasons I'd state. The work began that night. I started not with the car, but with the space. I cleared a wide berth around the Chevy, stacking old engine blocks and crates of parts with a new, ruthless efficiency. I hung fluorescent work lights from the ceiling beams, banishing the comforting shadows, turning my sanctuary into an operating theater. The first real step was the teardown. I attacked the Bel Air with a violence that was almost sexual. The air wrench screamed as I zipped off lug nuts. The ratchet clattered as I unbolted the ancient seized suspension. Every groan of protesting metal, every shower of rust as a bolt gave way, was a syllable in my new manifesto. This was my text. The grease under my fingernails was my ink. The torque wrench, set to precisely 98 foot-pounds for the suspension knuckle, was my punctuation. There was no ambiguity here. A bolt was either tight or it was loose. A wire was either live or dead. A fuel line was either sealed or it leaked. Cause and effect. You torque a head bolt to the wrong spec, you get a blown head gasket. You cross-thread a spark plug, you wreck an engine. It was a brutal, unforgiving, and perfectly honest language. I worked until my hands were raw and my back screamed in protest, long past the hour when I would normally have retired to the hollow silence of the house. The physical pain was a welcome counterpoint to the psychic one. It was a problem I could locate, acknowledge, and endure. As I finally wiped my hands on a rag, leaving dark smears of grime and blood, I looked at the disassembled front end of the Chevy. The wheel wells were empty, the steering linkage exposed like bones. It was a mess, a beautiful, chaotic, purposeful mess. I was no longer a ghost haunting a ruin. I was an architect of a new one. Leo would enter this space, and he would be lost. He would see only chaos, a pile of broken parts, the mad obsession of a decaying man. He wouldn't see the blueprint in my head, the perfect interlocking logic of the machine I was building. He would have to learn to see it. He would have to get his hands dirty. He would have to listen, not to my words, which had failed me, but to the language of the tools, the components, the unyielding logic of the build. On Sunday, he would walk into my garage, and his lesson would begin. The first step was to confirm my suspicion. The faint tremor in his car's engine was a familiar signature, a ghost I'd already diagnosed. So I left my oil-stained sanctuary for the sterile quiet of the public library, my thick fingers clumsy on their thin computer keys, to hunt down the technical bulletins that would put the manufacturer's name to the ghost I'd already felt in my bones. I navigated the same forums I would have from my own garage, and there it was. The cold, hard data to back up my intuition. Buried in threads written by grizzled old mechanics like me was the official truth, a known but rare manufacturing defect in the primary crankshaft bearing, the very fatal flaw I had already named. I printed the relevant pages, the laser printer whirring in the hushed room. The black text on white paper felt insubstantial, theoretical. It wasn't truth until you could lay your hands on it, until you could feel the play in the crankshaft with a pry bar and hear the telltale knock with a mechanic's stethoscope. But it was a start. It was the diagnosis. Back in the garage, the printed pages felt like a foreign artifact. I laid them on the workbench, waiting a corner with a dirty spark plug. They were my Rosetta Stone, the translation of my intuition into documented fact. Leo's sleek silver sedan sat beside the disemboweled Chevy, a symbol of his ordered digital world parked next to the beautiful chaos of mine. I didn't touch his car. Not yet. Let him see it first. Let him see the evidence before the operation. Sunday arrived not with a fanfare, but with the slow, inevitable creep of daylight across the grease-stained concrete floor. I heard his car door shut, the sound too quiet, too refined. He didn't come in immediately. I stayed under the Chevy, my back on the creeper, staring up at the labyrinth of brake lines and the oil pan. I heard the side door open, then his hesitant footsteps. He stopped just inside the threshold. I could feel his presence like a drop in barometric pressure. I rolled out from under the chassis and stood up, my knees popping in protest. He was wearing clean, dark-washed jeans and a grey hoodie, clothes that were meant to look casual, but had never known a day of real work. His eyes were wide, taking in the scene. The Chevy's front suspension scattered across the floor in a seemingly random pattern, the transmission sitting on a wooden pallet, the tools laid out on the red rag like a surgeon's instruments. "What happened to your truck?" he finally asked, his voice thin in the vast oily space. "Nothing happened to it," I said, wiping my hands on a rag. "I'm happening to it." Felt it through the floorboard. I could see him reading the words but not comprehending the reality they foretold. It was just information to him. Data. "So, there's a recall?" he asked, looking up with a spark of hope. "The modern solution? Pass the problem to someone else?" "No," I said, the word flat and final. "It's too rare, and too expensive for them to admit to. The dealership will throw sensors and coils at it until your warranty runs out. By then the crankshaft will have scored the block, and the engine will be a very expensive boat anchor. I popped the hood, the latch releasing with a solid thunk. The engine bay was a cluttered, plastic-shrouded maze, a masterpiece of packaging where everything was buried. It's a lesson. I don't know how to do that. You understand? Now go get the jack stands and take off that clean shirt. This language doesn't tolerate spectators. You have to speak it with your hands. I could see the fragile hope he'd been clinging to, the idea that this was just a big, complicated but ultimately solvable puzzle, dissolve into a colder, more profound dread. A ghost in the machine. A flaw you couldn't see, couldn't pin down, until the whole system failed. It was the perfect metaphor for the life he was trying to outrun. A tool that doesn't exist? He finally managed, his voice thin. What does that even mean? How do you fix something with a tool that doesn't exist? We have to give it bones. I ran a hand over the cool, greased bed of the lathe. The world sells you the problem and a very specific, very expensive set of keys. Most people spend their lives trying to find the right key, or begging for it, or stealing it. We're not most people. When the key doesn't exist, you forge it yourself. The entire philosophy of that engine is to be a sealed, perfect, impenetrable unit. It's designed to be replaced, not repaired. Our philosophy is different. We believe anything can be repaired. So we have to build a key that fits a lock the manufacturer never intended to be opened. I laid them out on the bench like a surgeon's pre-op inventory. He watched, silent, his initial terror slowly being replaced by a dawning, awe-struck comprehension of the scale of the task. "This is insane," he whispered, not to me, but to the universe. "It's engineering," I corrected. "The same engineering that designed that engine. They just stopped at a point that was profitable. We don't have that luxury." We continue. "I can't read this," he admitted, a fresh wave of defeat in his voice. "You will," I said again. It was becoming a mantra. I tapped a specific component on the drawing. "This is the main body. We start with the tube. Your job is to cut an 18-inch section, perfectly square. No angles, no deviations. The language, remember? Right and wrong. Frustration was better than fear. It was fuel. He selected another length of tube, measured with painstaking slowness, and clamped it down. This time, his movements were more deliberate. The blade descended, and this time, the high-pitched shriek was the sound of truth being carved from raw potential. The piece fell away, the cut end gleaming perfectly square. He held it up, a question in his eyes. I gave a single, slow nod. Right. He learned to deburr a sharp edge, to run a tap through a newly drilled hole to create perfect threads, to distinguish between the smell of cutting oil and the smell of fear sweat. His clean shirt was a memory, smeared with grease and grime. His hands, once soft, were now nicked and stained. He was no longer a spectator. He was deep in the grammar of the work, learning the verbs of torque and tolerance, the nouns of steel and socket. By midnight, the components lay on the bench, no longer a collection of raw stock, but distinct machined parts. They were the bones of our non-existent tool. We hadn't assembled it yet. That would come tomorrow. But we had begun. We had started with not knowing, and we had, piece by painful piece, carved a little island of knowing out of the vast ocean of his ignorance. He slumped into a rickety chair, exhausted, staring at the scattered pieces. "It doesn't look like much," he said, his voice hoarse. "It doesn't have to," I replied, wiping my hands on a rag. "It just has to work, and it will, because we made it. No one can ever take that away from you." I looked at him, truly looked at him, covered in the honest grime of hard work. The polished facade was gone, sand blasted away by effort. What was left underneath was raw, uncertain, but real. "Tomorrow we give our ghost a body." And then we put it to work. Each clang of the hammer on the anvil was a punctuation mark in the silent, angry letter I was writing to my son. The anger was a bellows, heating the forge to a white-hot intensity. With each strike I saw his face, the dismissive smirk at the dinner table, the cold calculation in his eyes when he spoke of efficiency and legacy. I wasn't just drawing out the steel. I was drawing out my own fury, purifying it in the fire, trying to transmute it into something useful. The hammer fell, and it was the sound of his condescension. The hiss of the hot metal in the quenching oil was the sound of my own frustration being cooled, hardened, and tempered. I was aware of Gus moving around me like a quiet ghost, his presence a steady counterpoint to my internal storm. I knew he wouldn't speak. I could feel him watching the coal, handing me tongs, and I could only imagine what he saw in the violent birth he was witnessing. But as the hours bled into one another, something in the rhythm began to change. The anger, so potent and all-consuming at the start, began to exhaust itself. You can only swing a 3-pound hammer for so long before your muscles scream a more immediate truth than your emotions. The sharp staccato bursts of rage softened into the steady metronomic beat of pure effort. My shoulder ached. A deep, honest burn that had nothing to do with my son, and everything to do with physics and fatigue. The letter I was writing was no longer silent and angry. It was becoming a long, detailed treatise on resilience, a lesson in not breaking. I looked over at the bench, at the scattered machined parts from our previous night's labor. They were the bones, and this thing taking shape in the forge was the muscle and sinew that would bring it to life. Gus's nicked and stained hands rested on the workbench, and I saw a reflection of my own, decades older, scarred and calloused from a lifetime of this same conversation with stubborn materials. He was no longer just a spectator to my anger. He was a partner in this act of creation. Finally, when the last curve was hammered into the central claw, I laid the glowing piece on the anvil for the final time. I didn't quench it. I just let it sit there, the heat washing over my face, the orange glow fading slowly to a dull cosmic red, and then to black. The silence it left was profound, broken only by the crackle of the cooling forge and our own ragged breathing. "It doesn't look like much," Gus said, echoing his sentiment from the night before, his voice barely a whisper. This time I didn't reply with a platitude. I just nodded, too tired for words. He was right. On its own, it was just a weird, blackened piece of shaped metal, ugly and brutal in its form. But I knew its potential. I picked up the cooled puller. It was heavy, solid, a dense concentration of intent. I carried it to the bench where the other components lay. "All right, kid," I grunted, my voice rough with smoke and fatigue. "The sermon's over. Now we build the church." It wasn't the violent, fiery magic of the forge, but the cool, precise magic of fit and function. We cleaned the threads we'd cut, coated them in anti-seize compound. We slid the freshly forged puller into its housing, the fit so tight it needed a few persuasive taps from a brass hammer to seat fully, a satisfying, solid thunk that vibrated through the bench top. We assembled the forcing screw, its fine, perfect threads engaging with the nut we'd machined with a smooth, oiled certainty that felt like a physical truth. There was no fanfare when it was done. One moment we had a collection of parts, the next we held a single unified object, a ghost given a body. It lay on the stained wood of the bench, a tool of pure purpose. It was not beautiful in any conventional sense. It was all leverage and bite, its jaws splayed like the legs of a steel spider, its central screw a blunt, unadorned spear. It was the physical answer to a question my son didn't even know he'd asked. Gus reached out a tentative finger and traced the line of one of the puller's claws. "It's cold," he said, a note of surprise in his voice. "Everything we make eventually gets cold," I said. The heat was just to get its attention. The real work it'll do cold. The weight was perfect, balanced in my hand. It felt less like something I had made and more like something I had excavated, unearthed from a place where solutions are simple, physical, and absolute. The anger was gone, completely burned away. In its place was a quiet, formidable confidence. This was no longer about my son, or his betrayal, or his slick corporate world of paper and promises. This was about a seized bearing in a gearbox. This was about a problem that could be solved not with lawyers, but with leverage. With this tool in my hand, I wasn't a wronged father. I was a mechanic. And tomorrow, I would go to work. 2 weeks later, the phone rang. It was Michael, his voice tight with irritation. "Dad, the car's making a weird rattling noise. I'm dropping it at the dealership." I stayed calm. "I could take a look," I offered. He scoffed, the sound a static of disrespect over the line. "Dad, please. This is a precision German engine, not a lawnmower. They know what they're doing." The arrogance was the perfect fuel for my fire. "All right, son," I said. "I'm sure they do." I walked to the garage, the scent of cutting oil and old wood a familiar comfort. The puller sat on my workbench, right where I'd left it after its creation. It wasn't on display. It was just there, a part of the landscape. Waiting, in the 2 weeks since we'd finished it, Gus had lost interest in the slow, methodical work of the garage, his attention captured by the flickering screens of his video games. But the puller remained, a silent, patient ally. I ran my thumb over the curve of one of its claws, feeling the same cold certainty Gus had noted. Everything we make eventually gets cold. I understood now that the same was true of resolve. The hot flash of betrayal had cooled into this. A plan. A simple, physical plan. The next morning I was at the dealership before it opened, sipping coffee from a thermos in my truck. I watched the service porters arrive, yawning and shuffling in the grey dawn. I saw the lead service advisor, a man named Mark whose photo was on the wall of the waiting room, pull up in a sensible sedan. I knew his type. He dealt in diagnostic codes and labor rates, not in problems you could hold in your hand. When the bay doors rattled open, I waited. An hour later, Michael's silver sedan, sleek and out of place, purred into the service lane. He handed the keys to a porter, exchanged a few words with Mark, and then left in an Uber, never looking back. Patience is a tool, too. I gave it an hour. Then I walked in, not through the customer entrance with its polished floors and free cappuccino machine, but through the open service bay, the air thick with the smell of gasoline, new rubber, and antiseptic cleaner. Mark looked up from his computer, his smile professional and dismissive. "Sir, you can't be back here. Liability." I gestured with my head toward Michael's car, already lifted on a hoist. My son's car. He asked me to take a look. The car's underbelly was a complex tapestry of aluminum shields and plastic panels. It was designed to intimidate, to say, "Keep out." Leave this to the experts with the proprietary scanners. But I wasn't looking for an electronic ghost. I was looking for a simple physical truth. And there it was. A small, black, cylindrical component bolted to the side of the transmission housing. The neutral safety switch. From it, a thin, shiny trail of automatic transmission fluid wept, a fresh bead poised to drop onto the pristine cardboard catchmat below. The rattling noise Michael heard was probably a loose heat shield, a red herring. This was the real problem. A slow, insidious leak that would eventually lead to a burned-out transmission and a repair bill larger than the down payment on my first house. I heard Mark's exasperated sigh behind me. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to leave. And then you'll call my son and tell him it's a $700 job for a 50-cent seal and an hour of labor." I pulled a grease-stained notebook from my back pocket, tore out a page, and wrote down the part number. I held it out to him. "Here, to save you some time. The car is under Mr. Albright's care now," he said, his voice cold. "I know," I said, letting the note fall to the workbench. "You take good care of it." I had looked the gatekeeper in the eye and shown him I knew the password. Michael would get the call later today. He would pay the $700. He would believe he had done the right, the sophisticated thing, and I would have the quiet, formidable confidence of a man who knows exactly how the machine works and exactly where to apply the leverage when the time is right. The real work, as I'd told Gus, is done cold. And my work had only just begun. The trap was sprung. 3 days later, Michael's phone rang. I watched his face fall as a voice on the other end explained that his perfect, expensive status symbol was now a useless, multi-ton paperweight. A catastrophic internal failure, they said, one that required a $50,000 replacement. I was in my garage, the scent of penetrating oil and old concrete a familiar perfume, when my phone buzzed on the workbench. It wasn't Michael. It was Sarah. Her voice was a tight, thin wire, stripped of its usual warmth. Dad. Just my name. A single loaded syllable. Sarah. Everything okay with the kids? I focused on the puller, its steel jaws clamped tight around a frozen bearing. This was physics. This was simple. That's a lot of money, even for him. Just said hello. I had not fully anticipated Sarah's instinct, her ability to connect the dots that her brother would never even see. I showed the man a part number, I said, my voice level. He didn't want it. That's all. A few $100s a month, the occasional grudging visit on a holiday. She didn't want you to use it as a weapon. It's the only kind he'd ever notice. Dad. His voice was a ruin of its usual confident baritone. It was stripped, raw. It was the voice of a man whose foundational belief that every problem has a price solution had just crumbled. Michael, you sound tired. Even expensive things. He was lost in the maze of their incompetence, and he couldn't see that the maze itself was the point. I don't know what to do, he admitted, and in that admission I heard the faint, satisfying crack in his armor. I can't just write a check for 50 grand. That's insane. I might know a guy, I said finally. Not a dealership, not a place with a fancy waiting room and free cappuccinos, a real mechanic. He's expensive, but he's not $50,000 expensive. He knows engines, not just computer codes. You'll have to deal with him on his terms. He'll know what to do. He would find the catastrophic internal failure, a tiny, fatal flaw that had allowed coolant to seep slowly into the oil pan. He would show Michael the evidence, explain the simple, brutal mechanics of it. He would charge him $5,000 for the repair and his discretion. Michael would be saved $45,000. He would be grateful, of course. But more than that, he would be unsettled. The unshakable order of his world would have been proven false. The dealership, the authority, had been useless. His salvation had come from the greasy, shadowy world of his father, a world he had spent a lifetime looking down upon. He would never know it was me. He would only feel the shift, the subtle transfer of power, and my work had only just begun. The machine was in motion, and every part, even my own son, was now a component to be adjusted, tightened, or replaced. The silence in my garage was a physical thing after I hung up the phone, thick with the scent of oil and the ghost of my own satisfaction. The puller lay on the bench, its sacrifice complete. My hands, however, didn't feel the usual post-repair calm. They were restless, charged with the energy of a trap being sprung miles away. I picked up a clean rag and began wiping down the already spotless workbench, the rhythmic motion a poor substitute for the real work. I was just the stage manager now, the lights dimmed, waiting for the main actor to take his place. I knew he would. Desperation, once it takes root, has a very specific gravity. It pulls you toward what you've spent a lifetime running from. He showed up at my house that evening. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a pale, hollowed-out desperation. He didn't ring the bell. He just appeared at the side door that leads into the kitchen, his silhouette a dark smudge against the screen. I was at the sink, washing the single plate from my dinner, and I saw him standing there hesitant, like a stranger who'd taken a wrong turn. He looked smaller. I opened the door, not saying a word. He stepped inside, his shoulders hunched, and his eyes immediately scanned the room. Not with curiosity, but with a kind of visceral discomfort. This was the place he'd escaped, the kingdom of grease and manual labor he'd built his polished corporate life in opposition to. He slumped into the chair opposite me at the small kitchen table, the one he usually avoided, the one with the wobbly leg I kept meaning to fix. He didn't apologize for what he'd said. He didn't ask how I was. He got straight to the point. His voice was a low, strained monotone as he explained the dealership's verdict. the phrase catastrophic internal failure sounding alien and terrifying in his mouth. Then came the number, $45,000, he said, the words hanging in the air between us like a death sentence. He looked at me then, his eyes full of a desperation I hadn't seen since he was a child, a boy who'd skinned his knee and needed the world to be fixed. "Dad," he said, the word a fragile thing. I can't. Is there any way you could loan me the money?" I let the silence stretch, watching him squirm in the vinyl seat. I took a slow sip of my coffee, letting the bitter liquid sit on my tongue. I wasn't just his father in that moment. I was an engineer observing a critical systems test. "Loan you the money," I repeated, not as a question, but as a statement of pure clinical fact. I shook my head, a slow, weary motion I'd practiced in my mind. "Michael, I don't have $45,000 lying around. My life isn't built on that kind of liquidity. It's built on things." I gestured vaguely toward the garage. "On tools, on sweat. Not numbers in a bank. I might know a guy. It's not some project car. Tell him it's about the Phantom." The quiet was different now, anticipatory. I looked at the shaft, clean and ready for its new bearing. I picked up the old, failed puller. It was a simple tool designed for one job, to apply immense focused pressure until something gave way. I turned it over in my hands, feeling its solid, uncomplicated weight. Michael was driving home now, clutching a phone number like a lifeline, believing in a random act of paternal grace. He had no idea he was the shaft, and I was the puller. He didn't feel the pressure yet. Not really. He only felt the relief that the broken part was being removed. He couldn't comprehend that the clean, undamaged surface left behind was now perfectly, irrevocably prepared for the new component I intended to install. A component of my choosing, a component of my design. The real work is done cold, and in the silent, oil-scented dark of my garage, I allowed myself a small, cold smile. The first adjustment was complete. The machine was purring. We stood beside the sleek machine, the memory of Michael's earlier visit hanging between us like a ghost. The thrill of its beauty was a distant memory, soured by the heavy weight of inevitability his desperation had left in its wake. He deflated, the last of his hope draining away, his shoulders slumping as if the air had been let out of him. He looked like a boy who'd just been told there was no Santa Claus. A pathetic sight in a man wearing a $5,000 suit. I let the silence stretch, let him marinate in the absolute certainty of his failure. The evening air was cool, carrying the distant scent of jasmine from a neighbor's yard, a sweetness that clashed with the bitterness of his despair. Then I looked from the car to the scars on my arm, a deliberate, theatrical gesture. I let my gaze linger on the twisted, pale skin, a roadmap of a past he couldn't begin to comprehend. "But the money isn't the problem," I said, my voice dropping to a near whisper, forcing him to lean in, to hang on the words. "The dealership is wrong. I know exactly what's wrong with your car, and I'm the only person in this state who can fix it. They said it was some kind of specialized ECU, a proprietary part. It's a flaw in the casting of the plenum, a harmonic resonance that develops over time. It fools the sensors, makes the ECU think it's running lean when it's not. It's not a computer problem. It's a ghost in the metal." He was a man who dealt in abstractions, stocks, bonds, market sentiments, and he recognized another man who was a master of his own, more concrete domain. "I can fix it," I continued, turning my back to him and walking toward the open mouth of the garage. "But not here, not with my basic tools, and not for free. Just please, not the world of catalogs and next-day shipping. The world of finding solutions where none are supposed to exist. Not just for money." The transfer was complete. The seed was planted. He was so focused on the digits on this new lifeline, he didn't even question the "your father" part. He just absorbed it, another piece of the strange, gritty puzzle he believed would save him. He left shortly after, his thanks mumbled, his posture still defeated, but now threaded with a fragile, uncertain thread of possibility. I didn't walk him to the door. I stayed in the garage, listening as his car started. That smooth, arrogant purr of a functioning engine, a sound that was about to become a memory for him, and pulled away. The quiet was different now, anticipatory. I looked at the shaft, clean and ready for its new bearing. I picked up the old, failed puller from the bench. It was a simple, brutal tool designed for one job: to apply immense, focused pressure until something gave way. I turned it over in my hands, feeling its solid, uncomplicated weight, the sharp, hardened tips of its jaws. Michael was driving home now, clutching a phone number like a lifeline, believing in a random act of paternal grace. He had no idea he was the shaft, and I was the puller. He didn't feel the pressure yet, not really. He only felt the relief that the broken part, his financial ruin, his social embarrassment, was being removed. He couldn't comprehend that the clean, undamaged surface left behind, the hollowed-out space of his desperation, was now perfectly, irrevocably prepared for the new component I intended to install. A component of my choosing, a component of my design. Gus wouldn't fix his car. He would confirm it was unfixable, a total loss, a financial black hole. He would be the final, authoritative nail in the coffin of Michael's old life of dependency. And when my son came crawling back to me, broken and humbled, that's when the real work would begin. Not to fix his car, but to fix him. The machine wasn't the Phantom in the driveway, it was my son's character, and it needed a complete rebuild. This was the harsh lesson he required. In the silent, oil-scented dark of my garage, I allowed myself a small, grim smile. The first adjustment was complete. The machine was purring. I led him into the garage. There, gleaming under the single bare bulb of my workbench, was the custom-forged tool. It wasn't just a piece of steel. It was a statement. I'd polished it after Michael left last night, not out of pride, but as a final preparation, like a surgeon sterilizing a scalpel. The light caught its edges, highlighting the brutal, purposeful geometry of its jaws. It was a thing of pure function, and in this world, function is the only truth that matters. I explained the flaw in the bearing, the specific signature of the metal fatigue I'd recognized by sound alone. I didn't just describe the high-frequency whine. I translated it for him. "It's not a scream," I said, my voice low and even, a stark contrast to the violent imagery. A scream is chaos. This is a pattern. It's a precise, repeating fracture, a microscopic fault line propagating with every rotation. It's the sound of a promise breaking. I held up my hands, turning them over so the scars on my knuckles caught the light, thick and white like old ceramic. I learned this language on the line, earning these. You look at them and see damage. I look at them and see the alphabet of pressure, of heat, of torque. The very things you despise are the reason your car isn't a permanent lawn ornament. He wasn't looking at a simple old man anymore. He was looking at his only hope, and the sight terrified him because it was a hope built on a foundation he couldn't control, couldn't buy, and couldn't charm. He swallowed, the sound dry and loud in the tense quiet of the garage. "So, you can make this puller?" He gestured weakly at the tool. "I already have." I corrected him, my tone flat. "The question is whether you're willing to use it. This isn't a gentle process, Michael. This is violence. Controlled, focused, necessary violence. You apply the pressure here." I pointed to the central screw, "and the jaws close with a force that can shear a bolt. It will scream. The metal will protest. It will sound like the whole assembly is going to explode. And then it will give. It will surrender. And you'll be left with a clean, empty housing. A void." He was so focused on the removal of the broken part, the source of his immediate pain, that he couldn't see the opportunity the empty space represented. He was a man terrified of the hole in his life, not yet understanding that a hole is the first requirement for installing something new, something better, or something worse. I don't know if I can do that," he whispered, his confidence evaporating like mist off hot asphalt. "You don't have to," I said, picking up the tool. It was heavier than it looked, a dense, compact weight of potential. I will, but you will watch. You need to understand the cost of a fresh start. It's never free. It's always paid for in the sound of something old breaking. He was tethered to me now, not by gratitude, but by a desperate, gnawing need. I positioned the tool, the hardened tips of its jaws finding their purchase on the inner race of the failed bearing. The fit was perfect. Of course it was. I began to turn the central screw. The initial resistance was firm, then stiff. A low groan emanated from the assembly. Michael flinched. I kept turning, my movement steady and rhythmic. The groan escalated into a sharp, metallic shriek. It was the sound I'd heard in my head for days, now made manifest. A physical agony of stressed metal. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Michael take a half step back, his face pale. He was hearing the death cry of his old life, and he didn't even know it. Then, with a final, deafening crack, it was over. The sound wasn't a break, but a release. A sudden, shocking silence followed, more profound than the noise that preceded it. I reversed the screw and the tool came away clean, clutching the destroyed bearing in its unyielding grip. I held it out to him. There, it's out. He had no idea that the hard part was just beginning, and that I was the one who would define it for him. The extraction was the easy part. The installation, the ownership, that was the real work. And I was just getting started. "I'll fix your car," I told him, my voice flat and hard. "But there's a price, not money." I watched his face, saw the flicker of hope, a tiny, pathetic flame in the damp ruin of his evening. It was the same hope that had him clutching his phone, believing a call could summon a solution from the sterile digital world he inhabited. I let that hope hang in the oily air for a moment before I continued. "You will come here, to this workshop, every day after you leave your fancy law firm. For 1 month. You will work with me. You'll get grease on your hands. You'll learn what it feels like to build something real, something that doesn't live in a stack of papers or a bank account. You will learn the story of every scar on my arms, not because I want to tell them, but because this work will write them on you too. That's my price." The metallic shriek of the extracted bearing still seemed to hang in the air, a ghost of the violence I had just inflicted on his machine, a prelude to the violence I would now inflict on his life. He stared at me, his lawyer's mind undoubtedly racing through loopholes, contingencies, and contractual objections. He found none. This was not a contract. This was a covenant, written in grime and sealed with the extracted, mangled heart of his Mercedes now sitting in my palm. "You're serious," he finally said. It wasn't a question. "The world you live in runs on abstractions," I said, turning away from him and placing the dead bearing on a workbench with a definitive clink. "Paper, money, promises, legalese, it's all a house of cards. Out here there is only cause and effect. A loose bolt causes a wheel to fall off. A failed bearing causes everything to seize. You pay for the fix with something of equal, tangible value. Your time, your comfort, your ignorance. That is the only economy that has ever truly existed." I held it out on my own palm, a perfect, gleaming circle of polished steel and fresh grease. "This is potential. Perfect, silent, and useless until it's installed under the correct pressure. It needs to be seated perfectly, or it will fail faster and more catastrophically than the last one." My eyes locked with his. "Consider this your installation. Ratchet." He fumbled with the tray, his hands so adept at tapping on a keyboard, looking alien and clumsy among my steel children. He found the socket. His grip was all wrong. "Not like you're holding a pen," I said, my voice a low growl. I stepped closer, and he flinched. I took his hand, repositioning his fingers on the cold, knurled steel of the ratchet handle. His skin was soft, unnervingly so, like you're trying to strangle the life out of it. This isn't a suggestion, it's a command. Your own strength is the only thing that stands between a tight seal and a fatal vibration. "This one," I began, my voice losing its hard edge and taking on the cadence of a chronicler, "was from a broken timing chain on a '68 Mustang. A kid's car. He thought he was a mechanic because he could watch a video online. He didn't understand torsion or shear points. I guided his greasy hands, showing him how to work the lubricant into every roller. The chain snapped. The engine seized instantly. A piece of the tensioner, a shard of hardened steel, shot out like a bullet from the side of the block. It missed my face by an inch and took this souvenir from my arm. He's an engineer now, a good one. He sends me a Christmas card every year. I could feel the resistance in him, the sheer towering disbelief that he, Michael Thorne, Esquire, was on his knees in a pool of his own making, being taught a primitive skill by a man he would otherwise never acknowledge. I was breaking down his pride, bolt by mental bolt. When the new bearing was finally pressed into place, a satisfying, solid thunk that resonated through the hub, he actually let out a shaky breath of relief. He looked at his hands, caked in black grease. The grime worked deep under his perfect fingernails. There was a strange look on his face. Not quite disgust. Not yet. It was the dawning horror of contamination. "Tomorrow," I said, wiping my hands on a rag. 4:30. Don't be late. I smiled. A thin, hard line. "Tomorrow," I said, "you'll learn about the scar from the exhaust manifold of a '57 Chevy, and you'll learn how to rebuild a carburetor. It's a delicate art. It requires patience and a complete and total surrender of everything you think you know." I opened the side door, a clear dismissal. The cool night air rushed in, a stranger to the shop's warm, oily atmosphere. "The car will be ready by the end of the month. The question is, will you?" The door's right there. The shriek of the metal was a physical assault in the close air of the shop. He flinched at the shower of orange sparks, holding the tool as if it were a venomous snake. I made him work. I made him sweat. Within an hour, a dark patch had bloomed between his shoulder blades, and the carefully sculpted hair was plastered to his forehead. He was breathing in the dust of decay, the metallic taste of old iron settling on his tongue. As we began the slow, methodical disassembly of the engine, I told him stories. Not the sanitized versions for corporate reports, but the gritty, grease-stained truths of the factory floor. I spoke of Joe Henderson, who could listen to a milling machine and diagnose a worn bearing by the pitch of its whine. I described the summer the ventilation failed, and we worked in 120-degree haze, our bodies slick with oil and sweat, drinking more water than beer just to stay upright. I showed him the meaning of a tolerance, not as a number on a spec sheet, but as a sacred space. I held up a piston and a sleeve. "See this gap? Too much, and she knocks herself to pieces. Too little, and she seizes up, grinds herself into a solid, useless block of metal. It's the space for expansion, for heat, for the reality of motion. Your world doesn't have tolerances. It demands perfection, which is why it's so brittle. It's about becoming part of what you're fixing." It was a hesitant, almost shy thing. He'd point to a part. "What's that?" He saw the order in my chaos, the meticulous logic behind every hanging chain hoist and stacked pallet of parts. One afternoon, wrestling with a stubborn oil filter, he grunted, "It's all a system, isn't it? A closed system. It's just cause and effect." He was just a man, on his knees, beginning to understand how things truly fit together. The demolition of his pride was nearly complete. The foundation for something else, something more substantial, was being laid, not with concrete and rebar, but with grease, grit, and the undeniable truth of a torque wrench clicking on a properly tightened bolt. The real work was finally about to begin. The final bolt, torqued to that same sacred pound-foot, felt like a period at the end of a long, painful sentence. I wiped my hands on a rag that was more grease than cloth, and gave a slow, deliberate nod to Michael. He met my gaze, the frantic energy of a man trying to escape finally gone from his eyes. For a long moment, the only sound was the soft creak of the garage as it settled around us. Then my hand moved. I reached for the key, my movements measured and sure, and turned it. The engine didn't just start, it breathed. The engine didn't just start, it breathed. A deep, resonant inhale followed by a purr so smooth and harmonious it seemed to silence the very dust motes dancing in the late afternoon sun. It was the sound of a flaw eradicated, a system restored to perfect, humming balance. The ragged knock that had been the ghost in this machine was gone, banished by our own scarred hands. In the sudden, profound quiet that follows a solved problem, I looked at my son. He stood before the car's grille, his head bowed not in defeat, but in what seemed like reverence. His hands, once soft and manicured, were now mapped with a topography of fresh blisters and healing cuts, a testament to a labor that was more than physical. He was staring at them as if seeing them for the first time. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low, fractured thing, stripped of its corporate armor. "Dad, it wasn't just for the harsh words spoken in this very shop weeks ago, or for the years of neglect. It was for his blindness." He was apologizing for not seeing the system, not just the engine system of fuel, air, and spark, but the larger, more fragile system of a family, of a father's pride, of a legacy that wasn't measured in stock options, but in the integrity of a well-set valve. I hadn't just fixed his car. I had forced him to become a part of the repair. I had forced him to get on his knees, to feel the resistance of a seized bolt, to understand the cost of forcing something that wasn't aligned. He had learned in the most visceral way possible that some things can't be bought or delegated. They have to be built, or in our case rebuilt, one painstaking turn of the wrench at a time. I let the silence stretch, letting the weight of his words settle into the oil-stained concrete. "I know," I said, my own voice rough. It was all I could trust myself to say. He finally looked up, and the smudge of grease was still there on his cheekbone, but the man beneath it was different. The corporate titan had been dismantled, his pride stripped down to the block. What was left was raw, unvarnished, and real. He was just a man, my son, standing in a workshop he finally understood was not a graveyard, but a place of resurrection. "The car's ready," I said, nodding toward the purring machine. "You can go. It needs all its parts to function. If one fails," he trailed off, the lesson he'd articulated days before now applying to a far more complex machine. He took a step toward me, his movements less certain than they were with a wrench in his hand. That day in the lawyer's office, I was just a part in a different machine, a corporate machine. I was following the process. I thought it was just cause and effect. I didn't calculate the human fatigue, but the real work, the messy, imperfect, and infinitely more complicated work of rebuilding the connection between us, was just beginning. The foundation had been laid, not with concrete and rebar, but with grease, grit, and the undeniable truth of a shared, accomplished task. "Calculations can be rerun," I said, picking up a clean rag and tossing it to him. "Systems can be recalibrated. It's getting late. Your mother would skin us both if we don't show up for dinner. She's making meatloaf."